Hi, my name is Matt Morris. I teach at the University of Colorado. I live in a community that got hit by a wildfire about 3 years ago, and we know what you're going through. So I lost my home with my family along with 1,000 other homes. Now, we know the scale of your fire is 14, 15 times that. We thought we were going through one of the most horrendous things of our lives, and you've scaled that up a lot. So our hearts go out to you. We're trying to give you something maybe practical to help you get back into a home. So the purpose of this video is to describe how our neighborhood rebuilt at scale, and we rebuilt rather quickly. And we'll provide this process that we used, and maybe you can use parts and pieces or the entire thing to help you rebuild and rebuild fast. And we also want to provide some hope, hopefully. The time you're going through right now feels extremely chaotic. It could feel hopeless. We felt that as well. We know what it feels like to lose the family mementos, the videos, the photo albums. We know what it feels like to have to replace all the annoying things, the driver's license, the credit card, the passports. We also know that you're displaced. My family, we lived in 5 different homes before we got back into our rebuilt house. We know you're probably underinsured. We were 91% underinsured as a community, meaning the insurance proceeds that we all got did not remotely cover the cost to rebuild. And we also know you're under time constraints, right? So additional living expenses for us, that gave us 2 years where the temporary housing we had was paid for. And then we knew at that 2-year point, it was going to be on us. And rents here in the Boulder, Denver area were not cheap. And we know that's the case for you out in the LA area. So we're going to describe the process that we went through to rebuild. And it wasn't the entire community, but it was a subset of the community. So again, we had 1,000 homes that were lost. We narrowed it down to our neighborhood in this effort. So we had 171 homes in our neighborhood. And what's nice in this process is to kind of draw a bow around a certain area that has like features. So in this case, most of our homes were very similar in size and similar in quality. We were on the average side of quality with our homes. There are places across town where very high-end homes, and you probably wouldn't want to mix and match those in this effort, and I'll explain more here in a minute. So the first home broke ground 8.5 months after the fire. So that's a pretty long run up to get to the first breaking of ground. Now, I'll explain why that is here in a minute. It's not just designing and then getting to a construction permit. So 54 of our homes, 32%, started construction within 1 year. So that's not a great statistic. Only 1/3 of our houses broke ground within a year, but it gets better. So 82% of our homes in our neighborhood started within 2 years. Now, what we'll describe here is kind of a big machine that takes a little while to get started, and then once it starts, homes start being built rather quickly. And that's what you can see with this statistic. The first home was complete 15.5 months later, so that was pretty awesome for one of our neighbors to get back, roof over their head, in their home, try to rebuild their lives and have some stability. 54% of our homes were complete within 2 years. So, that was the end of our additional living expense, and half of our community was back. Now, again, this was a machine that was starting to crank out a bunch of homes, and within weeks and months after that 2-year point, a lot of homes came online. They got their certificate of occupancy. So within 3 years, 3/4 of our neighborhood was back. And that's what I described earlier about it feels pretty close to being a neighborhood again. Now, the remaining 25%, I don't know the exact numbers, but I can say with decent confidence that those are folks who decided not to rebuild. And so those are empty lots that they either sold or maybe they're holding on to and trying to figure out what happens with their lot. So I would say for the most part, people who wanted to get back into a house were back within 3 years. Okay, the average construction time was 9 months. Now, we have relatively average size homes, and so 9 months we were pretty happy with that. Across town where the homes are bigger, they were looking at about a 1-year average. And the statistics you see here were all compiled by a very smart young grad student at the University of Colorado. So we thank her for that. So here's a timeline. I want to give you this right up front to show you what it took to get from the fire to basically starting construction. So our fire was at the end of the year, 2021. That meant we had about 2 years. Well, we had exactly 2 years for ALE, additional living expense. So that set the clock, that started the clock. We issued what we called a request for qualifications. And that's the point of this video. I'll describe more about that later. So we sent this out to builders. We were basically trying to pre-qualify them. So we had a phone book of builders that could suit our needs. We asked for their responses within 2 weeks. So that's rather fast, and I'll describe how that went with builders, and some of them weren't into that pace. Ultimately, 3 days later, we had as much as we possibly could get in that short amount of time. We compiled it, and we had a list of pre-qualified builders that we could send out to our community. Now, in the background and in parallel, there were other things that had to happen. So when you want to rebuild, there are actually two things you're up against. One is you probably can't build what you had before because codes have changed probably since you built your home, unless you just had a recently built home. Codes have evolved and been adopted over time, and now you will be obligated to build, you'll be required to build according to those new codes. So you can't necessarily build what you had before, and then you also probably can't build exactly what you want. Perhaps when your development was first built, there were constraints within the city or the jurisdiction where, the developer had to be held to certain setbacks. So you have your lot, the house could only be a certain distance from the lot lines. Maybe there were height restrictions, maybe there's some architectural standards, especially if you have an HOA. There are restrictions on what you can build back, so you can't necessarily build back everything you want. Now, our town, our community recognized that some of these guidelines were not practical. These homes were built decades ago, and architectural standards changed. So heights might need to grow a little bit. And there were some things that were constraints on a developer who was building house after house after house, and they had full control. And those constraints didn't really apply to individual homeowners now who had the full ability to design and build their own home. So I won't go into too much detail there, but just to tell you, there are other things happening in parallel that relate to you being able to build what you want and you having to build something different than what you originally had. So our debris removal was also happening in parallel. I know you're going through this as well. Most of us went for the FEMA-backed, county-led debris removal. And mostly the reason we did that was the price was right, and the time it took for them to do the debris removal did not impact our construction start, because there are so many other things that had to happen in parallel again that it didn't affect our timeline for construction. So you see here, roughly 6 months after our fire, our neighborhood was substantially cleared of debris. Now, that means you can start going and getting geotech reports. So soils did not change, over the last several decades since your house was built, but a geotechnical engineer, a structural engineer are going to be very hesitant to design a new home without getting a new geotech report. So that was the case for us. I'm not sure how it will be for you, but we were required to get geotech reports, meaning they bore down, they check out the soil and the rock, and they come up with the properties of the soil beneath your house and make recommendations for a foundation so it doesn't heave and settle. So we did that on a community-wide effort. This was a separate thing from the RFQ I noted above. We as a community went out to a geotechnical engineering firm and said, all right, if we get upwards of 171 homes, can you drill home after home after home and give us a break and also do it fast? And that's what happened. So the next step was to finish designs. So once you have those geotech reports and all the town guidelines and regulations are settled out, whether that's the codes or the declarations in your HOA, then you can finish your design. So all those were predecessors to finishing your design. So for us, our first building permits were submitted in July, so roughly 7 months after the fire. Then the jurisdiction has to review those permits. Best case, that's probably about a month, and that would be absolute best case. And since we were early in the process, it did take a month, and our first permits were issued in August, so 8 months later, 8.5 months later actually, and we broke ground on our first home. So then construction began, and there was a huge slug of permits that were going through the process. The town, the jurisdiction was reviewing those and approving them. Ideally, it was going to be fast. In some cases, it wasn't. But in many cases, it was relatively smooth to get those through. Our first home was complete in March the following year, so 15 months later, roughly. Okay, so I show you the timeline here because there are a lot of things happening in the background and in parallel that won't allow you to just design and build as fast as you want. So here are some images of our community. This is right after the fire where every home was lost in our neighborhood. 6 months later, this is when debris cleanup was done. So you can see just visually it feels so much better. Your neighborhoods now are just a chaotic mess. It's like Armageddon. I know it. I know what it looks like. And just that cleanup effort really provides a little hope. This was 12 months later, so it didn't look great at that point. And I mentioned earlier, we didn't have too many permits for construction at that point. So you have a few houses going up, not many, but then the machine started. And so you can see 18 months later, so a year and a half, we were building houses left and right. And after 2 years, 24 months, you can see our neighborhood was largely built back with several homes, still under construction. And then after that 3-year point, it looks quite a bit different. So again, I show you this to give you some hope that it's possible. Okay, so how did we do this? Here's some tips maybe that you could use. So right away, we had some awesome folks in our neighborhood who did neighborhood outreach. They tried to get a hold of as many neighbors as possible. And, where are you? What's your email? What's your phone number? So that we can be in contact. Shortly thereafter, we created a huge email list of everyone that we knew of. And we got to, I would say, at least 85% of the community that way. We also established some sort of message sharing site. I wasn't familiar with Slack at the time, but we use Slack. And, there's a lot going on in these things, but they're quite useful when you want to go back and review information that was established throughout time. So we also identified some construction-related subject matter experts in our community within our neighborhood. We quickly realized that there wasn't much help on the rebuild effort. There was a ton of help with getting food and getting clothing and insurance advice. But when it came to design and rebuilding, that we were on our own as homeowners. And quite frankly, it wasn't the obligation of the town to guide us through that. And so what we ended up doing was we found, a master plumber in the neighborhood. My background before the university was I was a general contractor building some complex, fast projects in the Denver area. And before that, I was an Air Force officer doing civil engineering work. One of the things we did was post-disaster recovery, which for me, that meant hurricane relief. So it's not apples and apples with fire relief, but it's in the same ballpark. There was a community planner in our neighborhood. So anyone who had some sort of experience that could help, we formed a rebuild committee. And I'll explain how that came into play here in a bit. Then we sent out surveys to all of our neighbors and said, what do you think? Do you think you're going to rebuild? How many of you? What's your timeline? So we had that 2-year ALE. Are you trying to get back with a roof over your head within 2 years? Or do you want to be more methodical about it? Or maybe are you selling your lot? Are you underinsured? And the answer was generally yes. And so we were trying to figure out motivations and priorities within our neighborhood. And then, are you interested in a community-wide effort? That was the last question of these surveys. So we are trying to do this at scale. If we can work together, we think we can do it faster and less expensive. Are you in? That was that last question. So let's get to the guts of what we did. So we issued what we called a request for qualifications, and this mimics construction out in the commercial world or the heavy civil construction world. And we sent this out to every possible builder we could think of. First, we established the scope. So we said the boundary of this is 171 homes in our neighborhood, and we described, the lot sizes, the typical home. Most folks were interested in a 3-bedroom, maybe a 4-bedroom home, so nothing enormous, kind of an average size home. So we established kind of the baseline of what builders would be looking at here. The intent was to rapidly and efficiently and formally collect information. So you could imagine, and maybe you've done the same, you're starting to call builders, you're starting to call architects, and thousands of people are doing that. Now, from the builder's perspective, this RFQ was very nice because we as a community, 171 homes, were asking the same questions once, and they could respond once versus having to answer calls and emails from 171 of us. So we were formally trying to collect that. Now, the builders who received this RFQ and were asked to respond in 2 weeks were not all receptive to that, as you can imagine. We were asking for a lot of things, which I'll describe here in a minute. And we as a community looked at that as a litmus test. So we are asking you, builders, to rebuild our community within 2 years. That is super fast at the scale we're talking about. So if you are unable to respond to some paperwork within 2 weeks, we thought you were probably not our folks, not our builders to talk about in this case. Nothing against you, but we need someone who can do this fast. So, we had more than half of our builders that we requested not respond because they either didn't have the bandwidth or they were not interested. And that's totally fine, and that's probably the first good step. Let's make sure we find the folks who are willing to put in the work and who have the horsepower to do it. So ultimately, the goal here is to create a list of pre-qualified builders so that folks in the community can see what they're all about, see their costs, see their schedule, maybe see some example floor plans, and start to weed through which are the builders I should talk to and which are the builders maybe I shouldn't. And ultimately, we're trying to find options for our neighborhood to rebuild. Or maybe this information was enough to say, maybe I don't want to rebuild. Maybe this is an effort I don't want to go through. And so we were just trying to be transparent with what people were up against. The one caveat here was this was not binding for anybody. And so we initially got some kickback from our neighbors who said, I don't like the way we're being governed here. I don't want to be participating in this. And it didn't require any participation. Ultimately what we were doing was saying, these are your options. Take it or leave it. You don't have to use this. So if you end up using this and you're getting some pushback, you're really just creating a phone book of pre-qualified folks. On the builder side, it's not binding for them either. We asked for pricing, we asked for schedule information, and we said, just give us estimates. We're not going to hold you to it because we know this is a rapid response 2 weeks after we give you the RFQ. Ultimately, we sent this out to 30 builders. And where did we get that list? It was anyone that we knew about. So there were some developers in the area. So they'd been building homes in our community for a while. Of course, we sent it to them. Anyone in our neighborhood who knew of a builder, we sent it to them. And then there was also a builders expo that was put on by a nonprofit locally, and we sent it to all of them as well. And that was about 30, and we ended up getting 13 responses, which maybe sounds low, but ultimately that was okay. So what's in the RFQ? Let's go through the guts of it. So when we did that first survey of the community of our neighborhood, we realized that most people, their highest priority was getting back within 2 years and finding an economical solution. So we are not a neighborhood that has, fancy custom homes. And so the vast majority of us were trying to get back in a hurry at a relatively low price. Okay, so we grouped them into what we called the production builders, and the compromise there was you'll get in fast, it'll be less expensive, but you don't get to choose every single feature of the floor plan. You probably don't get to choose all your finishes. You maybe can choose from 5 or 6 different home models, if that. and you don't get as much flexibility. In exchange, the builder's moving fast, they have economies of scale, their trades are getting better and better at each home, and that's why it's less expensive and faster. And then as you see from left to right, that was production. We also have custom on the other end of the spectrum. Some folks wanted to build out of completely non-combustible materials, so concrete, for example, and quite frankly, a production builder, someone who's been blowing and going through houses, that's not their thing. So unfortunately, after a fire, the fastest home type to get back into is another wood frame constructed home. Now, there are ways to build a wood frame constructed home where it increases your fire resiliency, and we're not going to go into that in this particular video, but there are ways to get back into a home fast and still have some additional fire protection beyond having to go to the other end of the extreme and build out of concrete and steel. Okay, so that was our community, and you can see the bell curve here. We were largely in that production category. So we knew where we were, and we wanted to ask which builders fit into which category. So at first we established a baseline. This is the scope I was describing earlier. So we said, all right, what's the quantity of homes that could be rebuilt through this process? That was a total of 171 possible. We talked about the approximate size of the homes and the lots. In this case, they were relatively small or average. We talked about the governing documents and regulations and codes. And the jurisdiction you're in dictates that. And so we made it easy for all these builders and said, we've done this homework. Here, follow these links and you can see what the codes and governing docs are. We made several assumptions. Now, this will require someone with construction and engineering experience in your community to come up with these assumptions, working with the Department of Public Works and working with the planning department and the building department. So we made an assumption that when the builder showed up, there would be no debris, that the foundations would be removed. So the reason we're doing all this is so that we're comparing apples to apples across all these builders. You don't want one builder pricing debris removal, the next builder assuming it's done, and then it's hard to compare across the board. So we tried to create this baseline so that we could have an apples to apples comparison. So some other things we talked about were utilities. We described where the water line would be cut and where they would pick up and take off from there. Electrical, whether that would be de-energized or not, and where it would be cut off. All the utilities we tried to capture and give them a baseline, again, so we can compare evenly. Site logistics, we described how there's going to be limited laydown for their materials and tools. We talked about the typical homeowner wants and needs. So when you come in here, builder, it's likely going to be a 3-4 bedroom house, 2 stories, probably an unfinished basement, but maybe an option for a finished basement, again, to establish that baseline scope. Then we said in the RFQ, we're seeking a turnkey solution. So that's a construction term. What that means is we want everything in this price and the services you provide. So you could very well go out to an architect, take those drawings, bring those to a builder. What we were looking for here was in the production build, give us everything. So that would include architectural engineering services, permitting, construction, startup, testing, turnover, the whole thing. And so that was how we framed it. So some more topics in the RFQ. We also asked for their fire resistance construction experience or training. We asked what their capacity was. So what is the minimum amount of homes you want to build to make this useful for you? So they're in this for a reason, right? They want to make money. It's a business, and we recognize that. And so we asked for, all right, if we could give you 10 homes, does that make it worth it for you? And so we looked at that range. Also, what's your maximum capacity? So for some of these big builders, and I suspect you're going to go to builders not just from California, but maybe Arizona and Texas, these folks can knock out houses like crazy. So maybe that upper limit is really high. Versus some of the smaller builders, maybe that upper limit is 1 or 2 houses at any given time. We asked for the schedule. How long will it take to design and build a home and get us a roof over our head? Now, again, none of this was binding, but we wanted to make sure we had a feel for what they thought it would take. And again, the production builders were saying 9-10 months, something like that. And the custom home builders were saying anywhere from 1 year to 2 years. We asked for any risks that they could come up with. So what are we not thinking about? Maybe we can coordinate with the town. So is there anything that's going to have a major cost or schedule impact that you can think of, builders, that we can try to tackle now before it's too late or before it gets ugly? And then we asked for conceptual house plans. Now, this was where we got most of the pushback. This required builders to go to an architect and rapidly come up with some house plans that fit in the typical lots of our neighborhood. So, as you can imagine, they weren't extensive, but that's okay. It started to guide our neighbors towards something that they maybe liked, okay? We asked for an approximate price. This was a square footage price, or, given your floor plans that you provided, what's the approximate total price? Again, approximate, we weren't holding them to it. But now, as a homeowner, you could see, oh, well, if this is at $250 a square foot, I might be able to afford that. And if this is at $350 or $400 a square foot, I probably shouldn't even look there. Okay, so this was the timeline. So what I was just describing was part of step one. So what we ended up getting was 2 weeks later, a bunch of proposals or qualification statements that answered as many of those questions that we asked for as possible. Now, some of them were not 100% complete, and given the 2-week time frame, we were totally okay with that. So we received those qualifications. We, the builder committee that we established within our neighborhood, compiled that, and we created a side-by-side comparison of all of them. Then we went out to our neighbors again and said, here's the list. These are the folks that responded. This is all the information about cost and schedule, and here's some floor plans. Where do you think you align? Is it the type 1 builder? So that's the production builder, relatively lower price, relatively fast. You don't get as many choices along the way. You have to compromise. Or are you on the other end of the spectrum on the custom side, where I'm willing to take the time, I have money to spare, I'm going to look for anything I want, anything and everything I want in this new home. And so we asked where people fell in that category. Now, if you fell in the semi-custom custom range, we were kind of done in that regard. So we gave you this list, and the small percentage of our community that was in that category, they just took it and ran with it. So some of them went to architects and builders that they already knew. Some of them used the pre-qualified list that we had, and then they started the custom design and build process. Now, most of our community, like I mentioned, probably 80% were more into the production build. Let's get this done fast and less expensive. That's where we went into step 2. Step 2 was we focused on 4 production builders. So it all kind of fleshed out where 4 of them rose to the top. The community really liked what they had to say. They liked their floor plans. Their price seemed to be right. Their schedule seemed to be right. So now we dove in deep on these 4 particular builders. And we created another subcommittee to do that. So before I get there, I'm going to show you the presentation we gave to our community on how to choose category 1, 2, or 3, in case you're starting to think about this as well. First of all, price. So price goes down when a builder has repetitive work. So if they can build house after house after house that are very similar or the same, you can imagine their trades get better, their material gets less expensive, they have less variables, and so the price goes down. They're more efficient. They have more buying power. And custom designs, on the other hand, your architect's changing layouts, you might want different fire resistant construction, higher energy performance, maybe heat pumps or extra insulation or solar. So that falls into green initiatives. And so you could imagine as a production builder, you don't have the ability to make all those changes and have every house unique. And so, all right, so now we're starting to figure out which is our priority. Is it price entirely, or is it customization? We also asked people to think about local experience. So some of the production builders were not from our community. They were from out of town. And, how important is that to you? They are going to be learning how to work with our jurisdiction, with our town. They don't know the local subs and suppliers. All of that is something they can tackle and get done, but there's going to be a little bit of a learning curve. How important is that to you? Quality is subjective. Several of these builders had their websites, and we could go out and look at some of their examples. The local folks, we were able to go and look at their local homes that were either under construction, or maybe they had a model home that we could check out. Schedule, of course, this was something I mentioned many times, that production builders are going to be faster, custom not so much. That was how to choose 1, 2, or 3. That was some of our guidelines there. Working together as a neighborhood can help. So then we said, all right, once we fall into these categories, let's consider neighbors choosing the same builder. You can imagine if a builder's building home 1, 2, 3, and they're all in a line, it's going to be more efficient and less expensive. Another thing also in parallel was our neighborhood had to come together to encourage the town to change some of those regulations that have been in place for decades, so that we could build more of a home that we wanted. And that input we got from builders informed us on what we could do and what we could talk about with the town. Some other considerations along the way, there were supply issues, enormous supply issues. When our fire came through, we were in the post-COVID hangover, and construction materials were horrendously variable and quite high. Of course, there are labor shortages across construction, and you'll feel that as well. We also recognized that 1,000 homes needed to be rebuilt. Again, you're in the 1415X category of that. So we thought as a community, boy, if we could move fast, we could set the precedent here. We could move early, get the builders going in our neighborhood, and we could get back sooner than later. And so what ended up happening was our neighborhood was leading that effort. And so we had the hiccups along the way, which we gave lessons learned to the other portions of our community, but we were also the ones who were getting in homes first. So if you consider this large-scale effort, that could very well be the case for you. Lastly, the design and construction process is nowhere near perfect. This was tough for some folks where, they want the perfect home. If you want the perfect home, it's going to take longer, it's going to be more expensive. And so people wrestled with that, and I just want to say that it will not be perfect, and something to consider. Is it more important to get the roof over your head and get into something, and maybe the pantry isn't where you wanted it, and maybe you didn't get the granite countertops? So try to come up with what those priorities are in your life. Okay, let's go through step 2. So this is when people decided at large that they wanted to go production. So what we did was we had a bunch of presentations. This was of course over Zoom because we didn't have a physical space, much like you don't. And so we hosted Zoom sessions every other day for the 4 shortlisted builders. And this was led by our rebuild committee within the neighborhood, so folks with some construction experience who could ask some very direct questions that they knew might be on the minds of a lot of the neighbors. At this point, we asked for refined plans and estimates. So we gave them a lot more time to really sharpen their pencil, give us the drawings that they could commit to. And so this was approaching more of a proposal and less of an information session. So we asked for those floor plans, cost estimates, and schedules. Then the rebuild committee created this absolutely detailed comparison list. So side by side, all these builders, which rebates could you get us? You'll encounter this soon where maybe your utility is offering rebates for, some higher efficiency mechanical equipment, heat pumps, for example, passive house. So all right, builders, can you get us to any of these categories of incentives or rebates? We talked about construction means and methods. So for the wood frame home builders, they panelize these walls, and they are a little bit more expensive when they pay for it up front, but they deliver it and they can build a home in 3 days. At least get the structure in place. So are you doing that, or are you stick building it 2x6 by 2x6? What are your warranties? What are some fire resistant construction options that you could provide on a production scale? What are your efficiency options? Will you offer me solar? The answer was usually no for us. Maybe in your community it could be yes. Mechanical equipment, appliances, finishes, fixtures. Can you give us a finished basement versus unfinished? We were trying to establish the options and compare across the board. And then lastly, what are our steps to get under contract? So up until this point, this is all at will information. Nobody is under a contract, but we want to get there really soon. So now once our neighbors decided that they wanted to go into this particular builder's world, how do I get under contract with you? how do I get on the list? Because, by the way, there is a list on the builder side where they're going to start with the first contract they got, and then they're going to the second, and so you don't want to be the 100th person on the list. So how can I get under contract with you soon so that we can get the process going? Again, you're going to compromise by going fast. You're going to have to make decisions fast. Again, that pantry might not be in the right portion of your kitchen, but you'll have a roof over your head faster. That's the choice you have to make. Okay, now with all this information, how do you choose? This was another presentation that we gave to the neighborhood. So first of all, look at the floor plans, look at the scope inclusions, which one gives you the most of what you want? Is it an apples and apples comparison? The price, the price was actually pretty close across our developers or across our builders. And so, it swayed one way or the other, but it was generally in the same ballpark. So why was it the same? And we talked about this. So the design, going out to an architect to create 4, 5, 6 different floor plans, that was relatively similar across developers, across builders. The labor, most likely they're going to use the same labor or similar labor, the production track home builders. So that's probably the same across the board. They all have good buying power. They're all buying very similar products. So the material is probably the same across the board. Equipment, they're probably renting or they own very similar equipment. And, they also have to get dumpsters and porta potties and everything. So these items were all very similar, at least they should have been across the board. So then how do you choose, which one's better? Well, if cost is similar, schedule, who can commit to a faster schedule? Who has more experience perhaps in rebuilding after a fire, rebuilding quickly, working with your jurisdiction, and then people, who will you be working with? Almost daily you'll be in contact with the builder, and do you like them? Can you get on board with working with them day in and day out? And construction's stressful, so you want to work with someone that you can live with working with. Lastly, do they have any insurance support? So along the way, insurance might get you a little bit more funding if you can do a code comparison and say, these are the code upgrades, insurance company, here's the estimate, I deserve more money. So are any of these builders savvy in insurance support? And that was a big win for several people who ended up contracting with those types of builders. So these are some of the considerations when you're choosing a builder. Now, when you have an RFQ, if you decide to do this, how do you draw the boundaries around which homes to include and which to not? So you probably want to find homes that are of similar size and lots of similar size, so that ultimately if you can find this production builder, they can do some repetitive work. Custom versus production, this works okay for finding a pre-qualified list for custom folks. It works really well for production, as I just described. If your neighborhood has a sense of urgency where the 2-year time limit is really important, then this might work well for you. Versus, we have a community across our fire region who they're custom homes, larger homes. They wanted to take the time to make it to rebuild how they want it. Lastly, restrictions and regulations. Are you in an HOA? That seems to put a nice boundary around it. Are you in a planned development that originally had a bunch of regulations and restrictions on the developer? That can put the boundary around it. So the point is, you can't go out to 14,000 different homes because they're so unique, but there should be an area boundary that can relate and be used in this RFQ process. You probably need to find some expertise to draft this RFQ. So we'll get some sort of template to you in some way, and so you can mimic as much as you like. Some of those assumptions, though, about debris removal, some of the code adoptions, working with public works, some of those things, you might want to find some expertise within your community, or perhaps the town or your jurisdiction can help you create those assumptions. And good is better than perfect. You're going to find, I'm sure you've seen this already, where you just have to move. You have to keep moving. Otherwise, it's just never going to happen. So try to get perfection out of your mind if your goal is to get in fast and perhaps under budget, or at least keep the budget down. You're going to meet resistance if you are the leader of this RFQ initiative. I met resistance because people did not think someone from the university knew what they were doing, and so we had to talk through that. We also met resistance from builders because it seemed like a really fast process, and it just had to be. So just know you're going to have some thick skin when you're trying to drive this process, doing things fast at scale. You're going to ruffle some feathers along the way. But it worked for us. So I want to tell you that ruffling feathers was well worth it for us. 76% of our homeowners got a certificate of occupancy, moved in within 3 years, so 3/4. And of those new homes, 88% use this RFQ list. So, the pre-qualified list, 88% of people use someone on that list. So it really made it more efficient for people. Some other considerations along the way, not necessarily RFQ related, get in good with the elected officials. So our elected officials definitely impressed us. They had us in their mind every step of the way, but they also have to follow the rules, right? So finding that balance was important, and getting in good with them is going to be helpful along the way. The planning department. So the planning department, they're not elected officials. They have to do their job, but they can be encouraged to do things faster, to do things that make sense, to do things that don't affect life safety and health. So you can bend the rules throughout this process. And if you can encourage these folks to realize this is an emergency, we need to make some changes fast, and we can't just do this status quo how we usually do it, then I think you're going to have some people working in your favor. Building department, same way. Get in with them early and try to describe that you're going to have a slug of permits coming their way. There's going to be an enormous amount of inspections coming your way because this is an organized community effort and the machine's about to start. So just want to give you a heads up, that's coming. Can you staff up and be ready? Public Works, there are a lot of different public works items that play into this, and it would be good for you to encourage all these departments and people to talk. For example, I won't go into much detail, but the new codes, if your jurisdiction adopts the new residential code, requires fire sprinklers in your house. When your original home was built, I bet that main or the lateral water line that comes to your house was undersized to support a sprinkler system. So if the building department's requiring you to put in sprinklers, the Public Works Department probably should upgrade their infrastructure. If they don't, every single house has to put this huge water tank and pump in their house to basically comply with that new fire code. That's just one of many where all these things need to happen fast. All these people need to talk together. And so someone with expertise in your neighborhood, someone with expertise in your community or in your jurisdiction needs to be rallying and communicating these things amongst all these parties. Lastly, we did not have an HOA. Your HOA has a lot of different restrictions, perhaps, if you're in one of those communities. So, that could very well change what you can and can't do. Third parties, so just know that all the utility companies will be in and out of your neighborhood at different times throughout this whole process, putting in new gas lines, water lines, teledata, and they're part of this whole equation. Geotech reports, we mentioned trying to do that on a larger scale, working together as a community. Some other things to think about would be construction logistics. Now, you've got one homeowner who started in July, you've got another homeowner that started in October, and it's kind of piecemealed throughout all these neighborhoods. It creates a kind of a construction logistics nightmare. Now, what we asked for, which we didn't accomplish, and I suggest maybe you try, is we asked for our jurisdiction to go find some funding to hire a construction manager. Someone who wasn't in the mix, who didn't lose their home, someone who could come in and help us orchestrate some of this site logistics on a community level. Because here's some of the things that you're up against. So as you're building home after home after home, you have to excavate an enormous amount of soil. So where do you put that dirt? People were just putting it wherever. And so early on, we asked for a central location for where to put all this dirt. And, as a community, it makes sense instead of just saying, all right, builder, you figure it out. Okay, we asked for one of the ballparks, just to put a ton of dirt there. They ended up giving us a street, and there was a mountain of soil. So dirt, parking, the trades have to park somewhere, and they end up parking all over the place. Dumpsters, every single home has a dumpster. Deliveries and material storage, so there's endlessly concrete trucks and material deliveries. And the combination of all of this clogged up all the streets. So, when you had a concrete pour and you had 30 dumpsters and you had 50 porta potties, emergency responders couldn't get through. Long story short, if you have someone who can orchestrate this, that would be awesome. We had a lot of growing pains along the way, and it was quite frankly kind of a messy situation. And it could get a little better with some expertise and just a little bit of funding to pay someone by the hour to come up with some plans that we can all abide by, so that we can get people through the neighborhood, we can have deliveries, we can have concrete pours, and not make it absolutely bogged down. Lastly, there was a security concern. A lot of material got stolen, a lot of tools got stolen, unfortunately. And so whether that's this construction manager who maybe can help with some guidance there, or just a security service or the police who can hopefully help with that, we encourage you to think about that too. So there are so many things to think about and so many things on the to-do list, and we hope that this process that we used can be used in part or entirely to help you out with your community to rebuild. I can tell you again, looking at these photos, that it felt insurmountable at the time when our fire ripped through our neighborhood. But again, 3 years later, we are largely back as a community. So I hope that gives you some hope. You're on our minds. Please reach out if we can help in any other way, and you're in our hearts. Good luck out there.